3, 2, 1, clap. I fucked it up. 3, 2, 1. This is stupid. I'm not doing this anymore.
Okay, that's it.
I also
Wrap it up.
think this is stupid.
All right. Sorry.
All right, let's go. All right, so we'll go in 5, 4, 3, 2. Hey everybody, welcome to Will and Drew's Gaming Retrospective. I am your host Drew, and I am joined by Will. Will, what's up, man?
What's going on, man?
Oh man, I'm super excited. We have two very special guests with us today. Some guys that are recording some great podcast content across the ocean. Longtime gamers. I'm thrilled to have them on the show. So we're just going to bring them right in. Let's just get to it. What do you say?
Let's do it.
All right. First of all, I'd like to welcome James and Patrick from Retro Spectives Podcast. Thanks, guys, for joining us. Welcome aboard.
Welcome.
Hey, great to have us. I'm glad you said my name first because I am, of course, the most important on our show.
I would like to say that I was intentionally going alphabetically, but that's not entirely true. It is super early here for podcasting. It is super late there for podcasting. What time is it right now?
It is 10:30 over here on the east coast of Australia.
Far too early in the morning.
Far too early in the morning. I just woke up.
Yeah, we're recording at 8:30 a.m. and it's a little weird. I'm not gonna lie, but I'm really glad that you guys made time to join us. I'm thrilled to have you on board. Big fan of your podcast, and tell us a little bit about that.
Well, firstly, thank you so much for having us on. I really appreciate it. When I was first getting into podcasting, Drew was kind enough to help us set up our Discord server. It's very intimidating making a podcast for the first time. There's so much stuff you have to set up. So I made a Reddit post, and Drew came to the rescue, and I basically ripped off half of his Discord server and copy and pasted it onto ours.
This is brilliant.
Yeah, I know. It worked out well. What James and I do is that we basically review retro video games from a modern perspective. So we've played heaps of these old games, well, old from our perspective, from the 90s and early 2000s. So games like Diablo and Heroes of Might and Magic 3 and some terrible games like Crystalis. But we've played a lot of these old games. Some are good, some are bad, but we discuss them in tremendous detail on each and every episode. And we try and come to a conclusion as to whether, these games were just good in the time in which they were produced, or if they're true classics that have truly stood the test of time.
Yeah, we don't care if they were true classics that stood the test of time. If they're trash today, we're going to say it, We have no respect for, the long legacies of these titles.
And the nature of our podcast is that James and I come from very different gaming backgrounds, and we have
so different.
Yeah, we have very different, things that we value in video games. So a large part of the podcast is us forcing games on the other person to see if they can enjoy them. But a lot of the time, we're forcing our own interests at the detriment of the other.
Well, you guys pick alternating each week, right?
Yes.
Correct, yeah.
So I've kind of gotten the vibe over the past. You guys are up to how many episodes now? It's 40-something?
30-something, 35, I think it is.
Right.
Yeah, around there, yeah.
So 34 episodes bi-weekly. But what I've kind of gotten the sense over time is like it's half I want to play this game because I loved it when I was younger, and half I want to play this game because fuck my co-host.
That's
wow. In my case, I think it's like 80% of my choices are, man, Patrick's gonna hate this.
It all depends on the game. Some of them are games that I kind of always wanted to go back and play but could never find the time for. So the podcast gives me an opportunity to, play a game and kind of get through it, whereas otherwise it would just sit in my Steam library forever. But some of it is like this game that everyone talks about as the greatest thing ever. And I was wanting to see if that's actually true, because I think that nostalgia is a very addictive drug, and the way you think of things in the past can be very different to how you actually pass them in the present.
Right. That makes sense.
Very much so.
Yeah, I think something that I've noticed is obviously people who kind of talk about these old games online a lot are the people who played them at the time, and of course have this huge nostalgia boner for these games. And, oftentimes we've gone back to them and just it hasn't hit us the same way because we've played all these new and modern games, which have, raised the bar of our expectations. And, a lot of that nostalgia-driven content on the internet just isn't as useful for people from our generation that I found.
Right. It's an interesting point of view.
I mean, have you guys ever looked back on a game and thought, a game that you love with fondness? Have you ever gone back and actually played it and tried to analyze it from a modern perspective? Because unfortunately, a lot of the time you do that and you get a rude awakening.
Yeah.
I think I'm afraid. I don't want it to happen. Drew knows about my love for Star Wars Shadows of the Empire, and I'm kind of afraid to go back to it because I'm afraid that will happen, that I'm not going to see it in the same way that I did when I was 15, 16.
Yeah,
well, nostalgia is very powerful. If you think about things that you grew up with, you have these fond memories, and you don't want that memory destroyed.
Yeah, you don't.
And that's a very fair thing to do. I'm not saying everyone has to go back to the things they love from when they were a child and put it into the harsh, light of day. But I guess it is interesting to see, which of these games are true classics. Because, I love film, I love books. And the best films you can watch today, it doesn't matter if they're 50 years old, and you can still have a magnificent experience. Some of the old spaghetti westerns, The Good, the Bad, the Ugly, for example, you can watch that today, and it's a brilliant film, and you can love it to pieces. And I think that, games, they're a much more amateur art form, but there will still be those games that 50 years from now you'll be able to play and enjoy and love, but they're few and far between.
Yeah, I think I'm really glad that at least some of the games we've done for the show have definitely lived up to their reputation. Like Castlevania Symphony of the Night, for example, I had never played, and I'm so glad that we did for the show because, even today, it's an excellent title.
It's a
I would recommend it to basically anyone. Yeah, that game has some of the best music in any video game I've ever played. I'm really happy that we got to experience it.
I've never played it either.
It's exceptional.
Yeah, it's one of those games that I've kind of dipped my toes in a number of times, but never really sat down with and dove into. But I was a huge fan of the Castlevania games on the Game Boy Advance and on the Nintendo DS.
Oh wow!
Those games
Aria
were
of
tremendous.
Sorrow and what was the other one?
Order of Ecclesia, something like that.
Yeah,
Yeah, that's it, I'm pretty sure.
Those games are very similar to Symphony of the Night, in terms of structure and everything. The fascinating thing about Symphony of the Night, and probably the reason it really stood the test of time, is that in an era where everyone was moving towards 3D games, it was 1997, so everyone was using the PS1 and the Nintendo 64 to explore 3D games. Castlevania bucked the trend and it made a 2D game on the PlayStation 1 hardware. So all those genius Super Nintendo artists got to really push themselves to their absolute limits and show a mastery of that pixel art style.
Yeah, as opposed to everyone else who was really, really floundering in the shallows of the hardware at the time. And we've definitely experienced that as we've played these older PS1 and N64 titles. Original 3D graphics are really aged quite poorly. I think, Ape Escape, and we've played... Oh man, Ape Escape! What a game! And a couple of the other titles.
About how ridiculous it is.
Yeah. It looks so funny now. The Uncanny Valley is unreal on some of these games. Max Payne is another one. It's just very, very odd to go back and have that weird feeling every time you look at a character model.
Yeah. So just one criticism I've always had of that era. Some of my favorite games of all time are from, the PlayStation 1. But Man, that is a rough generation overall. Those games, they really did not age very well looks wise.
Well, there was also the controls. One of our main problems with Ape Escape, it's something that people love about the game, but Ape Escape was the first game to have the analog sticks. It was like the demo for that game in a lot of ways, and we take for granted, like for example, controlling cameras. You know, you have one stick is movement, the other stick is camera. These games had no idea what to do with the analog sticks. They were elaborate gimmick buttons, basically.
And then, you know, you go even further back than that, and there's the games that needed analog sticks, like Armored Core, which is, you know, a 3D space, you know, third-person shooter that has no access to the analog stick. So you've got your aiming reticule bound to the shoulder buttons on the PlayStation controller, and it makes no sense intuitively. But, you know, it's kind of interesting going back to see these older titles and, you know, how far we've come forward. Just, I don't necessarily want to tell people to go and do the same.
One of the things that I've noticed recurring with your episodes, you know, on the topic of the controls, a lot of times I hear you guys are rebinding controls to try to make the game a little bit more palatable.
Yes.
You know, especially if you're playing on an emulator or things like that. And I've found myself a couple times yelling at my car stereo, like you're not experiencing the game the way it's supposed to be. You know what? Like, yeah, maybe the controls are broken, but why are you doing that? And I guess I kind of want to know, like, what is your thought process? And I'm not saying you're wrong, but you know, like does it actually make the game more enjoyable for you, or you know? Kind of elaborate on that.
Oh, hugely. Yeah, hugely a lot. I mean, I generally rebind the controls of every modern game I play as well. I just think that, you know, the people who design these control schemes just have different preferences, and I think control schemes are almost entirely preferential, right? No scheme is going to be right for everybody, and I just like to play something that feels natural to me, which is almost never the case with these older titles. Pat, what's your experience?
Well, I think that the thing about control schemes is that they've become... It's one of the things that has become generally increasingly refined over the years. Like, the way you're meant to experience Perfect Dark, for example, the Nintendo 64 shooter, on a Nintendo 64 controller is weird and nightmarish. Like, I don't know how much experience you have with playing Perfect Dark or GoldenEye on Nintendo 64, but there is no reason to play a shooter in that fashion, with you hold down a button and then you can kind of move around, but if you're not holding down a button, you use the same controller stick to move your character around. It feels so awkward and clunky, and I don't think anyone would choose to experience it in that way. So I don't know, if I can get a strict upgrade, I don't really care how people used to play it. I just want a comfortable gaming experience like James.
That's fair enough.
Yeah, one of the arguments we've gotten into offline a lot is that there are a number of console shooters that I want to do for the show, but Patrick utterly refuses to play a console shooter with a controller, and I think that playing these games that are kind of optimized for a controller with a mouse and keyboard is going to, trivialize the gameplay. But Patrick, you're a big Counter-Strike player. You played with a team for a while even, and I don't think he can adapt to a lesser control scheme in this way.
Yeah, this is something I've gotten into an argument with a lot of people about, right? even on your Discord, Drew, I got into an argument about it. Yeah, and there were many guys. Yeah, it was pretty gnarly, but the problem is I've played FPS games on mouse and keyboard since I was like 3 years old, so it's kind of like it's in my bones. And it's not like I've never played a Halo game on a controller or whatever when I'm at a friend's place, but I feel so at ease with mouse and keyboard, and with controller it just doesn't feel right. You know, it's like it's just an uncomfortable gaming experience, and I just don't enjoy it. So like, I guess I could play on a controller, but if I'm having so much more fun with mouse and keyboard and I'm able to do it, I don't really see what the harm is.
Okay.
Do you guys have a preference for controller preference? Like, I doubt you guys are as big into mouse and keyboard as I am.
You know what? I generally don't mess with them very much. I'm not one of those people that will go into the options and actually change the controls, which you can do with pretty much almost any game as far as I know. Even going back to old school games, I know you can do that. But yeah, I don't know. I think I generally just adapt. I can definitely say that the original Turok game for N64, I definitely changed at one point because I could not control the character with the C buttons anymore. Because that's how it is default. But yeah, I think I'm not really that guy. What about you, Drew?
I mean, it's kind of a genre thing for me. Generally speaking, in almost every instance, I prefer a controller because if I use a mouse and keyboard for long enough, I start having like carpal tunnel issues. My hands start to hurt. They cramp up. It's just not a comfortable environment for me. So I'll defer to a controller in almost every circumstance, but I don't do a ton of PC gaming to begin with. When I do PC gaming, it's almost exclusively strategy games. And there's no way to control those with a controller.
What about Halo Wars? Do you remember that game?
Oh God, I sampled that on the Xbox, and then I never touched it again.
I'm not sure how game stores work out in the US, but here in Australia, our local game dealer, EB Games, has this thing where if you return a game within 24 hours, they'll give you a refund, no question asked. Every single person I know that played Halo Wars beat the game in 7 hours and then returned it for a full refund the next day.
Wow.
I think I answered the question wrong. I apologize. I thought we were talking about like changing control schemes.
Oh,
right.
That was years ago.
But in terms of controller versus mouse and keyboard, I would still take controller, such as Drew would say. But mouse and keyboard definitely has its place. For Counter-Strike, there's no... I don't think there even is a way to use a controller, right?
Oh, you can, but you're going to be stuck in the lower levels. It's just the reaction speeds are just... It's basically Counter-Strike was built from the ground up as a game for mouse and keyboard, and while you can play with a controller, it's basically impossible. But there's plenty of modern shooters like Overwatch that you can play with a controller and be very successful.
Do they still make computer mice that have the little weights that you can insert in and out?
I actually have
awesome.
one of those. I actually do have a bunch of weights to put into my mouse, and it's relatively new.
how do you like that? Is it more comfortable for you?
I kind of just left it as the default, to be honest, when I got the mouse and haven't changed it since. So, I mean, maybe it helps.
So basically what you're saying is they should just make the mice heavier or lighter and not put weights in.
Yeah.
Hey, I like those gimmicky things, man.
Yeah, it's fun.
Little weight discs.
I mean, mechanical keyboards are definitely worth it. I love my mechanical keyboard. It was one of the best hardware investments I ever made.
Maybe I'm a heathen in this regard, but I had a mechanical keyboard for years, and then I got a new job a few years ago, which forced me to use this old shitty like Dell chiclet keyboard, and I loved that thing. I've been trying to find a keyboard that I like as much as this like $2 piece of plastic junk, and I cannot. I was considering getting rid of my $300 keyboard for this piece of junk, and everybody who I've told this to has reacted with utmost outrage. It's been very amusing.
I mean, I think ultimately you just have to use what's most comfortable for you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's about finding a comfort zone, whether that's with a mechanical keyboard or a controller or whatever the case is. It's about making your gaming environment cozy and comfortable and something that you want to come back to time and time again.
Mm-hmm.
Agreed.
That's a good way to put it.
Something that Will and I talk about frequently are these cozy places, or cozy environments for gaming, which is hilarious if you think about it, because like sometimes you'll be playing a game and you're just having just utter rage because the game is too difficult, or
and you're underneath a blanket.
Oh my god! Like I've been playing Doom Eternal lately, and the game is just pissing me the fuck off, and I'm just like yelling at the TV, but I'm in my cozy place
with a lavender candle, and you're like, fuck this.
Patrick, you didn't like Doom Eternal very much, did you? I think it's probably my favorite shooter, honestly.
Yeah, it's funny. I'm still trying to deconstruct exactly what about it doesn't really click with me. It's a very interesting game. Like, I'll give it that. And I think it's still a good game, even as one I don't love. I think it's basically the emphasis on resource management and dealing with the problem immediately in front of you, instead of it being, more of a free-form first-person shooter. I can never relax while playing Doom.
Oh, yeah.
It's always so frantic and blood pumping, and I keep forgetting to like change my grenade type to the normal grenade type and throwing that, and it feels like I'm concentrating more on swapping between my cooldowns than I am just trying to murder the demons. And I understand that you do all that with the end goal of murdering the demons, but it's like, it's so complex. It's so all of these systems laid over one another that you need to keep track of. It's a bit too much for me, honestly.
I think it's excessively complicated, and I think that makes the difficulty of the game really tough to swallow. I feel like it's there's a lot of things that the game does right. But when you're using every button on your controller, sometimes multiple times, it is a lot to keep track of and a lot to kind of deal with. And then to have the game expect you to use all of those buttons on a regular basis makes it even more complicated. And then just oh my God, like I am a terrible gamer. I'm playing the game on easy now. Like, I just could not. How far did you get, Patrick? Did you beat the game, or?
No. I got to a little bit past the first Marauder boss fight.
Okay.
And then I kind of I was playing less and less. Like, I played for 3 hours the first time, then an hour, then half an hour, then 20 minutes, because I was just getting frustrated. I started on Nightmare because I am an FPS nerd. But I eventually had to drop it to Ultraviolence because I was struggling too much. Okay. And even like Ultraviolence for me is like that's a massive concession. Like, I normally play all of my FPS games on the maximum difficulty 100% of the time. So and I just wasn't having fun in the end. Like, I just had to admit that I just wasn't having a blast. And even though I'd like to finish it someday, I don't think I'll go back to it anytime soon because I was just not enjoying the rotational cooldown nature of the gameplay.
Well, now I feel like even less of a gamer because like I started on Ultraviolence and then like in the first stage I'm like, fuck this. I put it on Hurt Me Plenty, and I played through most of the campaign up to that point, and then I'm not far from where you are right now. I got to that Marauder, and I just got so frustrated with it. I'm like, I don't have time for this, and I put the game on easy, and I was finally able to beat him. And I think I'm just going to leave it on easy, on Hey Not Too Rough or whatever they're calling it in this game. I just I don't have the time or the patience to play something that's stressing me out so much because I'm not good enough.
Yeah. I know. I think there's a lot of realism in that, because you want to enjoy the game, and it sounds like Doom Eternal really is very hard for some folks, and I don't think that there's anything wrong with lowering it so that you can actually enjoy it.
Yeah, definitely.
It's so disappointing for me too because I was so hyped for that game for so long. I mean, there wasn't a week that we recorded that I wasn't talking about my anticipation for it. And then the game came out, and it was super fun for a little while, and then they just started layering system after system on it on top of each other, and the Marauder is just like I can't imagine dealing with more than one of these guys, and I know it's going to happen.
Yeah.
But James, you enjoyed the game a lot more, didn't you?
Oh, I love it to bits.
Positive.
I think it's a big problem of the game that it introduces too much too quickly, which I think is quite overwhelming. Like, every time I took a break from the game and came back like 2 days later, I had to spend like an hour refamiliarizing myself with everything before I was back up to that level I was when I stopped playing. But man, when you get into a firefight in this game and you come out after, the 8 minutes of, just pure madness, I am sweating, right? I feel like I've run a marathon. I'm out of breath. It's just the sheer intensity and the engagement that this game keeps you in for that solid like 8 minutes is just insane. It's incredibly satisfying for me to go through, but I can definitely see why not everybody would like that.
Well, that's one of the things I think the game does right, and that's when I really enjoy it, and that's why I have like such this split personality when it comes to the game, because there are some things like the combat. When the combat is on, holy shit, it's on. And to your point too, like there's been a couple times where like I've been playing the game and then my wife walks into the room and she starts having a conversation with me and I'm in the middle of a firefight.
Oh Jesus!
And I just hard pause the game and I turn and look at her and I don't say anything until she's finished speaking. Because like my mind is in this different zone. It's like I can't explain it. Like I'm just my heart rate is up and I'm not sweating, but I could I'm just sheer focused on this thing.
One of the
Does she look like a capra demon?
A what?
Isn't it a capra demon?
Cadcademon.
Oh, I'm thinking
Cacao
Dark
demon,
Souls.
yeah,
Whoops.
yeah.
Seeing Dark Souls, yeah. The man with the two dogs.
I'm not a Doom guy yet.
Yeah.
Yeah, you got to get into that. 2016, I think, is a wonderful place to start. But so I just realized that we've been talking to you guys for about 30 minutes, and neither of you have told us where they can find your podcast.
Oh yeah, that's
We probably should have
that's
started
a good
with that.
idea. Patrick, you're the guy who likes to shill the show for us. How about you?
I know, and like on our show, I'm doing a terrible job of it. Okay, so we are called the Retro Spectives Podcast, so it's Retro Space Spectives Podcast. Our website is nice and easy. It's rspodcast.net. So we've got all of our episodes there that you can, directly download, or we've got a little widget for you to stream it on the site. We've also got a link to our RSS feed on the website if you want to add it to your own podcasting app. We're available pretty much everywhere. I also write lots of articles, usually in relation to the games, the classic games we've been playing each week, exploring like a tangential link related to it. So, for example, for our Diablo 1 episode that we did, I wrote an article exploring the way in which the action RPG genre has evolved over time into a completely different beast from what it once started, and how Diablo 1 has basically nothing in common with Diablo 3 and other games of its ilk, as an example of the sort of things there. So, we our Twitter is @RetPodcast, but honestly, all of our content is on our website. So if you want to find us in one place, it's rspodcast.net.
Very cool. Very cool. So let's talk about how you guys know each other. Let's start there. How did you guys meet? Like,
Well,
this is something that fascinates me.
Patrick and I actually played Magic the Gathering for many, many years, and so I guess the very beginning of this all falls down to me having a guest in my house. A friend of a friend got kicked out of his home, and his friend asked if he could stay at our house for just one night. And so, we're pretty chill, so we said, yes, this guy can stay on our couch for tonight. And then he stayed there for 8 months, as you do. And, that guy got me back into Magic after, maybe a 4-year hiatus, and then introduced me to Patrick eventually. And we've been, arguing ever since.
That's awesome.
Yeah, so Magic the Gathering is, of course, it's like a paper card game. I highly recommend you stay away from it if you value your wallet.
Yeah.
Although there's a video game version now that's considerably cheaper. But James and I always would get into arguments about video games, like all the
Always.
time. Like
Oh my God. We would ruin so many dinners.
Civil dinner.
We would ruin so
having a
many
civil dinner
dinners.
with our friends. And James and I would be at each other's throats over some stupid video game thing. And we're like, wait a second, why don't we turn this into a podcast?
So what were some of the games that you guys would argue over?
Metal Gear Solid was a big one.
Metal Gear Solid was a big one, yeah. Patrick really dislikes the story of Metal Gear Solid 2, whereas I thought it was really fun. And,
number 2.
Yeah, we went at it for that for a while. I definitely can see his side of things these days. 5 was the biggest one, I think. I loathe Metal Gear Solid 5, whereas Patrick absolutely adores it. So that would always come up.
I'm with you, Patrick.
Yeah, I mean, the story of 5 is complete nonsense. I'm not going to defend the story of 5, but that game is like a next-gen gaming experience. It's like one of the few. The level of, like, just the sheer amount of freedom you have in approaching your objectives is unreal. I've never played a game that's just like, all right, you pick your loadout, here's a town, do whatever the fuck you want. Here's your objective, do whatever you want. It's so much more than like GTA, and it's the polar opposite of a game like, Uncharted, which is so on rails, it's trying to give you a cinematic experience. Metal Gear Solid 5 gives you all the tools you want to create your own cinematic experience.
Yeah, whereas for me, it's almost the opposite. Like, I think that restrictions breed creativity, and when you have perfect control over everything, like you just have ultimate freedom to approach anything any way you want, I find that really boring because I don't need to come up with interesting solutions to problems. Like, anything I do will just work. So it really kind of bounced off that one because of that.
I've had some epic moments in that game of just running to the chopper as it's waiting for me with the dog, D-Dog, like just running with me, and I'm just like, and like the music's going, and I'm just like getting the chopper fly away, and my hair is blowing in the wind, and I'm like, oh my god, I love this game.
Oh yeah, having the chopper coming and blasting music was definitely my favorite part of it.
That was a lot of fun.
I always play those games like primarily as stealth games now that I'm grown up and not a 10-year-old child. But because my first Metal Gear Solid game, very suspicious. But when I was playing, I always start off stealth. But then when the stealth breaks, well, you got to improvise, right? You get discovered, and that's when the game really, really takes off. When you've got to somehow deal with 15 people tracking you down.
Yeah.
Or just Mother Base alone too is like a whole separate game.
Yeah.
I don't have a ton of experience with the Metal Gear games past Metal Gear Solid 1. So I always enjoy hearing Will kind of reminisce about, his favorite moments of these games.
Oh yeah, I've got tons.
It's one of those franchises that I've kind of always wanted to try to tackle, sequentially at some point. But it just never seems to happen.
It's an investment of time.
Yeah, it definitely seems like an investment. It seems like those games just get longer and longer the further into the franchise you go.
Yeah.
Generally.
When Metal Gear Solid 5 was announced, I went on that journey myself and played through 1 to 4 back to back. It was definitely worthwhile. And then I tried Peace Walker and hated it.
How long did it take you? How long did it take you to go through those 4 games?
I was playing it on and off, so probably about a year and a half. I was doing a dual playthrough kind of with my roommate, so whenever I played it, he had to be awake as well, and he's a bit of a night owl, so it took a bit longer because of that.
Okay, so it wasn't exactly like consecutive experience.
No, not at all. It would be pretty patchy, honestly, and I was playing it parallel to whatever I was playing at the time as well.
All right. Interesting. I may do a little bit of research. I feel like at some point I need to have a real heart-to-heart with Will about this series.
Yeah.
Yeah, I can get you warmed up.
I can only really speak about the first game, and I only played it, back when it was released. So my memory is very nostalgic at best.
Yeah.
It's particularly hard because of how, like, if you play the games in chronological order, the story is not unfolding chronologically. Like, you're starting the story in the middle, and then you keep jumping all over the place. One of the I talk about Video Game Donkey a lot. I actually think he's brilliant. But one of his best videos is him explaining Metal Gear Solid series. And the thing is, Donkey is a comedian, right? Like, everyone knows he's a joker. The funniest thing about him explaining the Metal Gear Solid series is that 95% of what he says is true.
Yes.
and that's...
And it's not exaggerated either. It's not like he's telling the truth, but in a funny way. He's just playing it straight the entire time, and it sounds ridiculous.
Yeah,
it sounds so stupid.
Yeah.
his ability to just kind of read everything like a straight man, in his quirky voice, I think is hilarious. Will, have you seen that video? Because if not, I'll have to track it down for you.
I still have not. Please send it to me though, because I'm curious about this guy. He's been, like I said, tossed around quite a bit in the Discord, and I'm intrigued.
Yeah. He recently did one on the Final Fantasy VII remake, and I thought that was absolutely brilliant too, because I haven't played the remake past the demo. I'm very familiar with the original Final Fantasy VII, and he kind of hits on like a lot of my concerns about the game, and one of the reasons why I haven't jumped into it.
Are you a big fan of 7?
I enjoyed 7 thoroughly, but it was also my first RPG, so it's kind of like it's my favorite RPG. You know what I mean? Like, I recognize the flaws of the game,
Well, actually, it's funny you say that because Final Fantasy X was my first RPG, and of course, it is my favorite of them all, as well.
Yeah.
I think that series in particular, really, because they're so different between entries, the first one you play to completion is probably going to be the one that you like the most.
Whereas I hate JRPGs.
Really?
I hate them.
Oh,
Yeah, I
it's so
loathe
good.
them. And in fact, it's a common thing I say to everyone that there are no good JRPGs.
It's even written on your bio on the website.
Talk about a hornet's nest.
Yeah.
I've never ever played a JRPG that I think is great, and I think most of them are garbage.
I can see everybody in our Discord room typing furiously at you right now.
Oh God! Oh my God!
So the storytelling in those games is just like, for one thing, I don't like turn-based combat. I think that I think that I hate grinding. I loathe grinding with a passion.
Oh my God, Chrysalis was a great episode.
If a game expects me to grind for 20 minutes, I will stop playing it on the spot, because how dare that game waste my time. Number two, I'm big into fantasy, but I guess you would say I'm into primarily adult fantasy. And I think that JRPGs, on the whole, are just shitty fantasy with pretty bad characters. So I'm yet to meet a JRPG story where I'm like, this is really excellent. Even something like Neo, which everyone gushes about, was only okay. Like, not Neo, Nier Automata. Everyone's like, this is the greatest story ever, and I'm like, it's okay. Like, it's not terrible, but it's only okay.
Well, I think you're looking at the inspirations, for these games a little bit differently. With the JRPGs, they tend to be more anime inspired, and I think with Western RPGs, they're going to be more hard fantasy inspired.
Oh, Western RPGs are trash as well. There's basically no good stories in any video games. I think the best way to tell a story in video games is to tell it in a very minimalistic fashion. Something like Shadow of the Colossus or Dark Souls 1. Or even God of War. God of War, I don't think is a masterpiece in the same way you do, Will. But I think that there's more depth to that relationship, kind of in the gaps of the conversations that he has with Atreus.
I would like to interject for a moment and point out the fact that Patrick wrote a very long story explanation on a JRPG called Vagrant Story that has been very popular with our audience because he loved the story of that JRPG.
I agree that was a well-told story, but if you actually look at the dialogue, it's still quite clunky. And the characters are still, I don't know, they're fine. I think Vagrant Story is actually one of the better RPG stories I've read, but it's still very, I don't know, almost mythological, archetypical. The characters don't feel super real as individuals. They're more these embodiments of power. I don't know. I'm kind of ranting a bit here without a loose thread, but in general, I think storytelling in video games is very poor. Is what I'm trying to get across, and I think there's very few video games with actual good stories, and I wouldn't really point to any of the Final Fantasies as having good ones. But
traditionally, I think the Final Fantasy games are kind of a clusterfuck. But as far as the story goes,
I can agree with that.
But I mean, do you think that with the focus of your podcast being on so many older games and kind of looking at, older versus newer games, do you think that the storytelling has evolved, or you think it's still kind of stuck in a rut?
Excellent question. I think that cinematic storytelling is the best it's ever been. I think that more dynamic storytelling was probably better in the early 2000s. Although we've started to remedy that with the indie revolution that really started kicking off in the post 2010-11.
Right. What was it? Bastion was one of the first ones to kind of...
Bastion is a fantastic example, yeah. I think that basically, and this is obviously a big kind of high-level thesis view of the game development industry, but I think that as we moved into the 2000s, particularly mid to late 2000s, I think games started was, they started to be taken seriously as an industry. And I think that they started to take huge amounts of influence from movies in particular. And that's why games like Uncharted started popping up, and why, believe it or not, Call of Duty as a game franchise from COD 4 and Modern Warfare 2 onwards, it started becoming this cinematic experience as opposed to being a game about shooting guns. Now, that's led to some movie experiences that some people love. Stuff like Last of Us, the new God of War is a great example. But the amount of dynamic sort of story gameplay experience, I think, also decreased at that same time, because the nature of movies is that the person watching the movie has no control. And so control was increasingly wrested away from the player in order to create these more cinematic experiences. So in some sense, our control over them is the best it's ever been, but I would argue at what cost? You get far less, of these immersive sim-like experiences, these more creative and experimental sort of games that were really big in the 90s and early 2000s. Although I have hope in the indie scene.
I mean, the indie scene is stronger than it's ever been at this point.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Especially with, I think the Nintendo Switch is helping with that significantly too, because there's a lot of games that I think up until maybe 2 years ago would never appear on a console. They're coming out for the Switch as well too, and I think it gives developers an incentive to kind of look past Steam. And as great as Steam is, it's kind of a wild west of indie gaming right now. It's a bit of a dumpster fire.
Yeah.
It's impossible to find a new quality game on there. Every day there's just hundreds of asset flip type games just appearing on the front page. It's basically you need to know about the game beforehand if you're going to buy it on Steam.
Yeah, and then you have something like the Nintendo Switch and Limited Run Games is producing physical copies of a lot of these games. It brings a little extra attention to them that may not have been there previously. So I think it's a good thing for the industry overall.
It is a good point. The closed ecosystem nature of it with fewer titles means that those individual titles do stand out more.
But I mean, as a whole too, there's a lot of shovelware on the Nintendo Switch too.
Yeah.
Like, you go into the eShop and you can tell like half of these things are just Android ports. But you buy a game for a penny, and a lot of people do. It's like, well, what's 3 pennies? I have 3 pennies in gold points already. What the fuck? I might as well buy it.
Actually,
I'm
find
guilty
the
of it.
Switch eShop to be relatively expensive compared to most PC online storefronts.
Well, I think generally consoles are always going to be more expensive than PC games. Maybe not on launch. You're going to have that initial, price fix. Everything's going to be the same. But once you get past the launch window, the PC market really does become more cost effective for the player.
Oh yeah, totally.
And the Steam sales are just ridiculous. Like, I had to stop going on them because I would just buy. I'd spend like $10. I'd get 150 games, and I'd just never play any of them.
Oh Jesus! Yeah, I had to stop that addiction years ago because I definitely had a problem with it.
I had been strongly opposed to using the Epic Games Store for many, many months, on opposed to their exclusivity and other things I didn't like about the platform. It was a very immature piece of software in many ways that didn't have many features on it. But over Christmas, they were giving a game away for free every day for 12 days, and that's one way to get a new customer.
They're still giving away 2 free games every single week. It's actually insane. I've got a library of like 100 games, and I've spent like $50 total on that shop.
Yeah, I'm in the same boat. Like every month I get the free games, but honestly, I haven't played a single one of them.
There is one game. I don't want to detract too much, but there is one game that the store is worth, and it's The Outer Wilds. I don't know if you've heard of it either.
I've been wanting to play that. That's been on my must play list.
Hasn't Puck's been playing that and talking about it, Drew?
He was playing that back when it came out, I think.
Gotcha.
It was my favorite game of 2019. If you enjoy exploration in video games, it's the best exploration game I've ever played. It's not flawless. It's definitely got some problems, but that is a game that has a great story, and the way it unravels and unfolds before you is truly wonderful. Yeah, I think that's the one game where I was like, all right, I'll get the Epic Store because this game is worth it.
I know it was on the Xbox Games Pass for a little while. I'm not sure if it still is. I sampled it and I couldn't get very far. Like, I just didn't have the patience or the time to like really dive into it. I was messing around with that part where you're like trying to launch your ship, I think at the very beginning.
Yes.
And I was like, okay, well, maybe not. but I mean, I'm sure you're noticing a pattern where basically I'm terrible at games, so.
We're all terrible at some games.
I suppose.
Sekiro. Just saying. Speak for myself.
I think everybody's bad at that game.
Yeah, it's really funny. One of the things we tried to do when we first started our show was to play all the games we review on the hardest difficulty as kind of like a challenge almost to see how far we could push these older titles. One of the earlier games we did was the original Quake. And, you know, as we've mentioned, Patrick's quite adept at first-person shooters, where I have never been very good at them, although I have enjoyed them in the past. And he's like, you'll be fine, just play on the hardest difficulty. And so I did. And then I spent like 3 hours on the second level and dialed it back a couple. So we've definitely had that experience when trying to make each other play games we're not so familiar with.
The flip side happened to me as well, because I've never really played a racing game before outside of like Need for Speed Underground 2. And James made me play this racing game called F-Zero GX, which is like the most hardcore, fast-paced moving racing game in existence. And it was, oh my god, it was impossible. It was so hard. I was stuck on level 3 and I had to rage quit level 3 and grind Grand Prix for like 5 to 6 hours before coming back
to the third level.
Yeah,
I think
those games are brutal.
Yeah, definitely. It was funny because you were trying to get us to play Star Wars Pod Racer, which, you know, I was like, oh, if he's okay with that, surely we'll be fine with F-Zero.
God, I love that game.
Oh, it's so good. I think it just came out again for Switch, I believe.
Oh, is it out?
Yeah, I think so.
Oh my god, did it really?
Limited Run put out a bunch of Star Wars games, and I'm pretty sure Pod Racer was one of them.
Yeah.
Oh.
I'm looking at their site now. Maybe I'm mistaken, but yeah, they just reissued a bunch of Star Wars games. Pod Racer's in the mix somewhere.
I remember when I got the 64 was my first console, and I got it when I was maybe, I don't know, I must have been in the second grade or something. And I remember Pod Racer was one of the games because we got it for Christmas as kids, and we got 3 games. We got 1080 Snowboarding, Pokemon Stadium, and Star Wars Pod Racer. And I remember playing Pod Racer for hours, and my parents would always walk past and be like, how are you playing that game? It's so fast. So it's just, they were just completely blown away. They couldn't tell what was going on screen, but I loved that game to bits.
Such a parent thing to say.
Yeah.
How do you see what's going on?
I remember Pod Racer because I used to go to after school care, and see, I didn't have a console when I was younger. So I only had PC gaming, but there was a Nintendo 64 at after school care, and so we all used to share. And I used to play Pod Racer, and it was you only got to play for like 10 minutes before you had to pass it on to the next kid. But those 10 minutes were glorious of me repeatedly crashing into the same wall over and over again.
Well, let's dive into that a little bit, Patrick. You know, what did you start with? What was the first game that you played?
So I don't know if the first game I played was actually me playing, because my dad was really big into gaming. He's told me the story of he used to work on a military base with some Americans, and one of his what?
I'm sorry.
What?
I know. He put up with it as well, but I think Yanks and Australian soldiers get along all right because they've both got the same sort of sense of humor, so it was all right in the end. But his friends started telling him about this game that had just released in the United States. You couldn't even get in Australia, and it was called Doom. And he ended up getting a copy of it for my dad, and it came on 34 floppy disks because it was so huge. And my dad get it all set up. And what I used to do is I was like 3 years old, and I'm sitting on his lap, and I'd just keep pressing spacebar, thinking I'm helping my dad win the game. And I used to say, my dad used to tell everyone of this. I used to say when he came home, I'd look up to him, I'd say, "Doom, Daddy, Doom," because I wanted him me to play it so much. So from the tender age of 3 years old, I'd been exposed to the violence of Doom, and there was no going back from that. After that, it was like all the other PC games. Duke Nukem 3D was a really big one in our household. We used to play over the internet with my dad's friend and his son. Mm-hmm. And the Red Alert games were the other big one. Red Alert was really funny because basically my dad and his friends split a copy, like they paid half and half. And the way it worked back in those days is that there was a Soviet disc and an Allied disc. When the Soviet disc was in, you could play the Soviet campaign, and when the Allied disc was in, you could play the Allied campaign. So they just took a disc each. So we got the Allied campaign, which was always enormously disappointing for me because I played through the Allied campaign a lot, but I always wanted to play as the Soviets, and I never ever got a chance to do so.
The bad guys, quote unquote.
Yeah, the bad guys. Yeah,
they always had the coolest shit in the Command and Conquer games. You know, Brotherhood of Nod with the Tesla or the Obelisk of Light, and then the Soviets with the Tesla coils. And, oh man, I always loved that shit.
Yeah, but I got the boring good guys things, like they had the light tank and the machine gun. It's like, come on, I want the mammoth tank. I want the cool ones.
Yeah. Oh man.
Yeah, so it was all PC games for me up until I got a console eventually, but I was always one generation behind.
Okay.
So really, PC games are my bread and butter and always have been.
So, James, same question to you. What did you start with?
So Dad used to work at a like an engineering firm, and sometimes he would come back from work with, some old floppy disks with some games on them. He'd come back maybe once every couple months with a new game. The first game I ever played was called Putt Putt Joins the Circus. It's like an educational kind of game. It's not as exciting as Doom there. So, and I played that one game for many months as a 6-year-old or something. And every day, Dad would come home from work, and I'd say, "Dad, did you bring me any games? Dad, did you bring me any games?" Until one day he said, "Are you ever going to say hello as the first thing you say to me?" Like, no. And then the next night he brought me back Tomb Raider, which was made me very happy. But I think that I remember distinctly that game. I think it was like the first Tomb Raider, and in the first level there was this bear, and I was terrified of the bear, and I could never beat that game because every time the bear came on screen I got too scared and turned the game off. So that lasted a very long time, playing, like old shitty educational games, until my mother decided that, she wanted me out of her hair, so she would every week take us to Blockbuster, which of course was, a company that rented and sold DVDs, or, well, probably didn't even have DVDs back then, VCR and old PC games.
Right.
And it was from Blockbuster that I discovered my love of JRPGs, with renting Final Fantasy X for the first time, and then after that a Dragon Quest game, and Pokemon, and from there on it was all downhill from there.
Well, that's one way of putting it.
Yeah.
The correct way to put it.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, ever since starting this podcast and discovering Patrick's strong opinions about these games, it's been my absolute pleasure to force them upon him, whenever I can.
So, go ahead, I'm sorry.
I was going to say, so I played a lot of these PC games when I was younger, but, I was a dumb kid. I didn't really have any idea what I was doing. But there was one game I played after I, got my first PC. Like, I built it when I was about 14 or 15 years old, like all the money I'd saved from a part-time job. And it was the first Deus Ex game. And in a lot of ways, that game has been the most influential on my life, and I guess the way I perceive video games, because prior to that, video games were about murdering people, right? Like that's the sum total of it. And while Deus Ex does have a lot of murdering, there's so much more going on with it. It's an RPG, it's a problem-solving game. it's got this conspiracy story, and it has this one moment that's very small but was quite brilliant. Without getting too spoilery, there's a point where you're ordered by your superior to kill a civilian. And every game up to that point, well, I mean, you have a mission, you have to complete it. But the game, without telling you, it has this option of, instead of killing the civilian, you kill the person who gave the order. You kill her, and the person lives, and the story changes. But the game doesn't telegraph that as an option at all. It's just something that's there if you have the, I guess, creativity to try it. And discovering that was something I could do, it blew my mind. Like I was so amazed and impressed, and it really opened my mind as to what video games could be, because it doesn't have to be going along a single path following the objective. It could actually have these meaningful story moments.
Can I just say that the soundtrack in those games,
tremendous.
Oh my god, they are absolutely amazing.
Captures that cyberpunk feel perfectly.
Very much so, especially in the newer ones like Mankind Divided and what's the other
Human
one?
Revolution.
Yes,
yeah.
Those two. I have the soundtracks for those, and I listen to them often.
Yeah, it's this like kind of atmospheric techno. I don't know if you guys have seen Cyberpunk, not Cyberpunk 27. I mean the new Blade Runner movie.
Yes.
It reminds me a lot of that soundtrack. Those kind of like walls of sound that just that you can just lose yourself in.
Yeah, Vangelis did the original Blade Runner soundtrack, and he's definitely inspired not just movies but games as well. Deus Ex, 100%.
He's a god.
Yeah. That's a series that like I've kind of dabbled in as well too, you know, with Human Revolution and what was the newest one again?
Mankind Divided.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, Mankind Divided. I think Human Revolution was recently free for like Xbox games with gold or something like that, and I grabbed it and I started playing it, and it's super immersive. It's a ton of fun.
Yeah, it's tough too, actually, at times. Very tough.
Oh yeah, no, they're very deep games. I'm not sure what I was expecting, but it wasn't any of it. You know,
I think Human Revolution has the best implementation of a kind of interrogation style system of any game I've ever played. I really enjoyed kind of trying to figure out the personality of the person I've spoken to. And I'm surprised a lot of games haven't really tried to do that since. You just kind of get these like Fallout 4 inspired dialogue wheels that's like yes, no, sarcastic yes, sarcastic no, and it's so boring in comparison. Yeah, no.
There's a game, it's on PC and Switch called the Red Strings Club.
You were talking about the other week. I remember listening.
Yeah, there's a bit of an interrogation path that you can go down, and you can manipulate the characters that you're interrogating based on what alcoholic beverages you serve them. And it's very interesting because if you serve them the wrong drink, it will shut them off, and they won't answer your questions, or you'll miss like crucial pieces of evidence in discussion.
Once again, indie scene to the rescue, right?
Yeah,
totally.
Indie scene's killing it, you know. There's some amazing stuff coming out right now. So
love it.
I think that a lot of RPGs also kind of undermine that sort of system, because there's almost always an option where if you have a high enough stat in the right spot, you can just auto win a conversation, if that makes sense. Like it's like charisma, strength, intimidation. You just go, well, I've got a high stat of this, so I get this free win in this conversation. Whereas the Deus Ex ones, they felt more, I don't know, you really had to figure it out and come up with the correct response. And, you know, there was no cheating.
Yeah, it's the difference between just like power leveling your character to get past any obstacles, or, you know, actually trying to use intelligence to navigate through a game.
Yeah, which I really like about dialogue options. But yeah, like James said, it's far less common than it should be, I think.